Great. I'll yield the remainder of my time, but appreciate the guests being here and appreciate the chairman for hosting the committee.
Senator Vance, Senator Van Hollen of Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here and for your testimony. Earlier this month, the FTC released its annual report on consumer activities, and they reported that my state of Maryland is among the top 5 states with the highest per capita rates of reported fraud. And this has been an ongoing issue in Maryland as around the country, and it takes all forms, as the conversation today has indicated. I want to focus for a moment on one area of this kind of fraud, and right now the failures of our system to catch it and compensate people for it. We have an open case in Maryland where the victim of check fraud reported the fraud right away. But their local bank, their home community bank, is still awaiting payment from the much bigger bank in which the fraudulent check was deposited. And I'm hearing a lot from Maryland community banks about this, and I think their view is well expressed by a letter that I have here from the Community Bankers Association of Illinois, written about a year ago, and I'm just going to quote a part of it. Our members have been particularly frustrated because these fraudulent returns have been deposited into accounts at the nation's largest banks, and the process to determine the liability for the fraud losses and reimbursement is protracted. When this issue has been raised to federal regulators, the responses have been that it's not their responsibility to intervene in bank versus bank disputes. Our members respectfully urge the OCC, Federal Reserve, and the FDIC to reconsider your position regarding fraudulent return in light of the information included in this letter. This is a letter that was addressed to them. They make the point that they're not asking federal regulators to pick winners and losers. They just want to expedite this process so that those who have been defrauded can be made whole, and those who were negligent in cashing a fraudulent check will end up making the payment. If I could start with you, Ms. Sanchez-Adams, can you speak to this issue and whether or not, in your view, the larger banks are taking advantage of the weaknesses in the system to prevent quick payment to the local banks so that they can in turn reimburse a defrauded customer?
Yeah, so one story that we were contacted about was a man who sent a check to the IRS, and it was deposited into, I believe it was Wells Fargo account, and it was to the U.S. Treasury. And so clearly they are not the U.S. Treasury, but they delayed for 2 years to refund the consumer's bank. And so the consumer, though the law says a consumer should be reimbursed by their own bank, that bank was dragging their heels because they were waiting to get payment. And the consumer's bank was also a large bank. So it's not like they didn't have the funds to refund the consumer. And I also just want to point out another problem with check fraud and check alteration is that it's not just them stealing it in the mail, but I've heard a lot of stories about, in particular, one that I mentioned in my written testimony, where they didn't even have checks associated with their account, and fraudsters create checks out of thin air. And because banks don't often provide written statements anymore, and they don't provide copies of checks back to consumers, it's hard for them to know that this is happening, or especially when it's altered, to know that it was altered if you don't see the check to see that it was altered.
I appreciate that, and this we saw a big rise in this sort of check fraud during COVID, but it's continued, and obviously it impacts those who don't do online transactions, mostly the elderly. Mr. Benda, if you could talk to this issue. I mean, obviously you've got members of different sizes, member banks, but this is clearly an issue that's hurting community banks. Do you agree that the federal regulators should be more engaged in resolving these issues?
So, Senator, I appreciate the question. I don't think anyone thinks that the check fraud processing system is working as well as it could. Banks of all sizes agree the timelines to process these are taking too long, and that's why the industry is taking its own steps to try and figure out ways that we can accelerate this process, such as developing a universal claim form. We see sometimes banks will file a claim with one bank, and they'll have to go iterate to make sure they provide the required information. trying to reduce the information the customer is required to provide. So trying to make this process easier. In terms of the regulator involvement in this, I agree with them that they don't pick winners and losers. I think it really, because each case is so different, it really needs to be that determination between the banks.
Well, I understand. FinCEN and other regulators, they do pay attention, obviously, to the SARS reports and sort of major fraud, but a lot of this fraud that's impacting, regular people is falling between the cracks, and those regular people are left holding the bag. So I appreciate that you, as well as I think you, Ms. Sanchez Adams, also spoke to some language that we put in the FISG appropriations reporting language. I chair that subcommittee. It's aimed at creating more of a public-private partnership to really try to plug the holes and gaps in the system. And I understand you both agree that that would be a smart move. Is that right?
Yes, Senator.
Agreed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Warnock from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Fraud is a serious problem in the United States, and in this sector is growing. A Gallup study found that 8% of respondents said that they had personally been a victim of fraud in the past year, 8%. In the first quarter of 2023, reports of financial fraud per capita occurred more often in Georgia than in any other state, according to data published by the Federal Trade Commission. Forbes Advisor ranked Georgia